Hey everybody, welcome to the video. Today I'm going to talk about Napoleon Hill, Tarot, the Mastermind, and the Invisible Counselor's technique, all reimagined and showing how they can connect. Now, to start out with, what is the possible connection between Napoleon Hill and the Tarot? Napoleon Hill wrote the book Think and Grow Rich. Did he also use tarot? Well, there is no evidence at all that Napoleon Hill used tarot. I don't even know if Napoleon Hill was familiar with the existence of tarot cards back in those days, although I think the Tarot of Marseille deck would have been available to him way back in the 1920s, but it just hadn't really caught on in Western society, I don't think, not to the extent that it has today. But in his book, Think and Grow Rich, Napoleon Hill talks about how he works with certain spiritual units, spiritual entities in various formats that I would tend to think of as being a different representation or a different understanding of the tarot archetypes. Now, what Napoleon Hill talks about in his book, Think and Grow Rich, among other things, is a concept called the mastermind. And you may have heard of the mastermind. That's where a group of people gather together, and you need a bare minimum of 2 or 3 people, and they join together more or less as equals. There will be leaders within each mastermind, but the participants are more or less participating around a round table where everybody is, to be served equally, pretty much. And what happens when you get these people gathered together for a common purpose, solving a common problem? These minds, these human minds, will begin to work together harmoniously. And then as they are meeting together, as they are discussing, certain participants will become aware that ideas are being brought up that they would not have thought of outside of the mastermind. And this led Napoleon Hill to believe that when you had, say, 2 or 3 people gathered together for a common cause, that another mind would come into the mix, more of a spiritual mind, what he referred to as a mastermind, in which you would have 2, maybe 3 or more people talking about something, and then just out of left field, ideas pop into the minds of certain people in the group meeting, and they begin to discuss these concepts, these ideas. And sometimes these people will say, I don't really know where this thought came from, but it just popped into my head, and I think this could be one of the answers we've been looking for. And so what Napoleon Hill would refer to as a mastermind session would be more than just human beings talking together and working out problems. It would start as that. But later on, as these mastermind sessions became more truly masterminds and got more deeply involved in the process, another overmind, a mastermind, would be added into the mix, contributing ideas, contributing creative concepts. Now, Napoleon Hill didn't know what to call this. I think he just called it the mastermind. Later on, he also refers to the mastermind and various manifestations of the mastermind as spiritual units. But I believe that this is one manifestation of how people can come into contact with the tarot archetypes. In each tarot deck, you've got 78 different cards. Each card represents a different spiritual archetype. Now, what are the archetypes? Well, the archetypes are beings that live in the unconscious, the collective unconscious of the human psyche. Now, I know that's a lot. But Carl Jung went into this, and again, I kind of explored some possible connections between Carl Jung and Napoleon Hill. They were both contemporaries, but I found no historical evidence that one actually learned from the other. But they did seem to hit on this idea independently of the archetypes. Now, the archetypes can be seen as different thought forms, but they're more than just the imagination. They are original thought forms that exist in the collective subconscious, collective unconscious, the deepest level of the unconscious mind. And in the collective unconscious, they are there lying dormant. They can be influencing us. They can be influencing everybody on the planet, because something that is in the collective subconscious or unconscious, the collective unconscious in this case, everybody on the planet has access to this pool of information. And it's just a matter of what technique do you use to consciously access these archetypes that live in the collective subconscious. And the different archetypes, I can think of a few examples. You've got like the hero, you've got the child, you've got the mother, the universal archetype of mother, the universal archetype of the father, the emperor, the ruler, the sage, the thief, the rebel, all kinds of different archetypes that are represented in the tarot, and many different archetypes that Carl Jung, discovered in his own research. And once you find a way to more consciously commune and access these archetypes, the more powerful you can become in your thought, in your imagination, the greater access you will have to a pool of information that is available to all, but which is accessed generally by just a select few, because most people are not aware of the existence of the archetypes. When people think of their own imagination, they think they think in terms that I'm just making something up. But they don't stop to consider that, yes, in your imagination you make stuff up, but there is power in that imagination, in that imaginary process nonetheless. And a lot of very creative people get paid top dollar in our society for being able to use and harness the power of their imagination and do it well. People get hired to be creative consultants and things like that. And business people or common people that are trying to solve a problem can find that they can have a greater degree of success in solving that problem when they learn how to employ their active imagination. Just get into the power of imagination and getting in touch with these different archetypes and getting access to a level of information that most people just don't know about. And so for them, it's out of reach. But in the context of the mastermind, this is where Napoleon Hill says 2 or 3 people can gather together. The bare minimum would be a husband and wife, 2. Husband, wife, child, 3. And when you have these minds connecting together in a mutually beneficial way, you get another mind introduced into the mix, something that he calls the mastermind. And I believe that Jesus talked about this too in the Gospels when he says, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in their midst. And so, yes, I think it's seen in terms of a Christian context. Jesus was probably speaking of what Napoleon Hill calls the mastermind. Jesus identifying himself as the mastermind who would come into the situation wherever 2 or 3 people were gathered together in his name. And it's the same with the mastermind, where 2 or 3 people are gathered together in order to solve a common problem. There the mastermind is, to work with them and be with them, working in the background, as it were, within their midst. So this is something that not just in Christianity, a lot of other world religions talk about this same concept. And of course, Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich, talks about it too. Now, that's how we can connect Napoleon Hill and the mastermind and the tarot together through the tarot archetypes. Now, what Napoleon Hill also talks about in his book, Think and Grow Rich, the chapter on the sixth sense, what he calls the 13th path to riches. He talks about ESP, the imagination, the sixth sense, and what he calls the invisible counselor's technique. Now, this gets kind of woo-woo a little bit. It also gets kind of exciting for people like me, because when you talk about a normal mastermind, what you have is a group of people gathering together as equals for a common cause, a common purpose, and then the mastermind is introduced into the group to lead, to help suggest possible solutions to various people within the group. Now, in the invisible counselor's technique, this is not done with other people. This is a technique, it's like a mastermind that you perform all by yourself, a solo mastermind. But how Napoleon Hill talks about this process is that you sit in your room, you imagine yourself meeting together with other people who have the expertise to help you solve a certain problem. In Napoleon Hill's practice of this invisible counselor's technique, he enlisted the aid of Abraham Lincoln, Napoleon Bonaparte, I think Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison, who was alive at the time but was not physically present within the room, but Napoleon Hill would call them together in his imagination and have them come together in the context of a board meeting. And the board meeting would be conducted for a certain purpose to help Napoleon, Napoleon Hill solving a problem. And Napoleon Hill set himself up as the chairman of the board. And in his imagination, he would call these thought forms together. And at first, things were pretty much under his control. He would be controlling it in his imagination. He would be imagining Abraham Lincoln, for example, contributing some wise words of wisdom. He would be imagining Thomas Jefferson or Thomas Edison, and Napoleon Bonaparte and others, how they would be interacting with the group. And for the first few sessions, he was confident that everything was under his control. But what began to happen, something that really spooked Napoleon Hill in the beginning, is that these archetypes, what I call archetypes, he called them members of his invisible council, they began to develop personalities that were separate from his own. Personalities that had their own sense of humor, personalities that had their own sense of timing. Some of these guys would come in early. Some of these guys would come into the meeting late and be making up all kinds of excuses, why they appeared late. They would be manifesting themselves in his imagination as independent living beings. Not flesh and blood living beings like we are, but independent living beings living and working within his own imagination, his own subconscious mind, that he would be using his imagination to bring more to the surface. And yeah, it spooked him because he felt like this was out of his control. What kind of Pandora's box have I opened here? And he shut down the practice, I believe, for about 6 months. And then he had a dream in which, I forget who it was Abraham Lincoln. Somebody spoke to him in the dream and instructed him on what was going on within these invisible counselor sessions that he had given up on. And he was told that when he was involved in this invisible counselor's technique, he would not be talking to the ghosts of Abraham Lincoln or Napoleon Bonaparte or Alexander Graham Bell. He would not be talking to the dead, but what he would be talking to would be the spiritual units. That's the way it was put to him in the dream. He would be gaining access to the spiritual units that surrounded all of those figures during their lives. And now, even though they were dead, those spiritual units were still accessible. And every time that he participated in the invisible counselor's technique, he was gaining access to these same spiritual units. Now, I would tend to think along Jungian thought lines, along the thought lines of a tarot reader, that these spiritual units are either very similar to, or possibly even the same as, the different archetypes that we see reflected within tarot cards. Remember, within tarot, we got 78 different cards. Each card can represent at least one different archetype. And so within a pack of cards, you've got some access to 78 different thought forms living in the collective unconscious of the human psyche. Thought forms that may have influenced, great people throughout history and minor people throughout history, and thought forms that can be accessed by you as well. And when Napoleon Hill was told this little bit of information about this invisible mastermind, this invisible counselor's technique, he decided, okay, I'm not scared anymore. I'm going to go back to having my meetings, and we're going to bring these spiritual units into the mix and see what happens. And so he began the invisible counselor's technique again. Abraham Lincoln was there. Abraham Lincoln kind of took the floor for a moment or two and said, our friend Napoleon Hill has returned to us. Let's welcome him, and let's all work harmoniously together to help Napoleon Hill solve his problems. And yeah, he was connected once again in his imagination to these great figures from history and to the spiritual units that surrounded those great figures during their lifetimes. And I would argue that those spiritual units, well, that's just another way of saying tarot archetype or archetype in general. So, to bring this all together, how does this matter to anybody who wants to read tarot, or maybe somebody who already is reading tarot? Well, the exciting practical upshot of this is that once you get comfortable doing the invisible counselor's technique, you can approach tarot in much the same way. Instead of using tarot as a fortune-telling game, instead of using tarot as a card game, instead of using tarot for divination purposes, you can be using tarot on a much deeper, much more practical level. You can be dealing out the cards, having access to 78 different archetypes, and just shuffle up the cards, and then ask a question, deal out the cards, and then see what the archetypes are telling you about the question, what answers they have to give you. And once you get good at doing this, you can find a lot of information can be revealed to you through the cards. It's not done through magic. It's not done through demonology or witchcraft, like a lot of people tend to suppose. This is done by using these cards as keys into the universal unconscious mind. Here we have the magician, the miracle worker, the magi, the wise man, wise woman. A lot of different archetypes can be seen within this card. And that archetype is something that exists in a living sort of way, although not a flesh and blood way, but lives within the universal unconscious. And once we tap into it, we can gain information that would normally be hidden from us. And so, just by getting good at using the cards, getting comfortable with using the tarot cards, you can have your own invisible mastermind, and you can invite in certain tarot archetypes. You can deal the cards out randomly. I've done that, and see what kind of answers you get. If you want to do a more focused approach, you can think of the archetypes that you would like to enlist, for their help, for their aid. And then find those cards, lay those cards out in a spread, and then contemplate that spread. Not a random spread, but one that you have laid out yourself. And then see what the archetypes are saying to you. Tarot lends itself to this because, remember, the archetypes speak to us in our active imagination. The tarot cards are designed in such a way that it really sparks our imagination. It gives us something to focus on, gives us something to think about, gives us something to fuel our imagination. And then once we get good at accessing our imagination and applying any insights gained to the problems that we have in this life, the more we will notice that things begin to open up and we find ourselves closer to the solutions that we seek in our life and to having clarity about the situations that we face in our day-to-day lives. So, in my opinion, tarot is vastly underrated. It is demonized as being a tool of witches and demons and things like that. The foolish, superstitious people are afraid of it. But those who are wise, who work with it with an open mind, who work with it knowing the true power of the imagination and the collective unconscious, see the tarot not just as a tool of divination, not just as a tool of fortune telling, not just as a tool employed by charlatans and scammers all over the internet, but as a tool for wise people to connect with these universal archetypes and apply their wisdom to your day-to-day life. And so, tarot is completely underrated in my way of thinking, but it is something that I think is beneficial to a great many people. Now, if you are prejudiced against the tarot, if you think this is the preview of demons and witches and ghosts and goblins and things like that, probably better for you to stay away from it. But if you know, accept the possibility, accept the reality that there is an unseen world that influences the seen world that we live in. There are archetypes living in the collective unconscious. And if once you begin to realize that by tapping into this collective unconscious and using it in a more conscious way through practices like meditation, practices like daydreaming, practices like prayer, practices like tarot reading, once you learn how to do some of those arts, if not all of them, then you avail yourself to a world of information that is hidden in plain sight from the average person. So if you want to find this doorway, I encourage you, take a few minutes every day to practice meditation. That's the first stepping stone as I see it. If you'd like, get a deck of tarot cards. Start working with the archetypes. Do a little deep dive online, learning about what the archetypes are and how you can access them through imagination, through tarot, through meditation, through your dream states. Pay attention to your dreams. Pay attention to your daydreams. What goes on in our inner world, within our minds, and within our imaginations will later begin to manifest themselves into our outer worlds. When you take an active part in constructing your inner world, you are also taking an active part in constructing your outer world. And using the tool of the tarot, you can become more adept at creating a better outer world by rearranging and better understanding your own inner world. With me, tarot is not about fortune telling. It is not about predicting the future. It's about understanding what's going on within our lives right now, in the present. And then once we understand that, we are empowered to create the future outcome of our desires. That is the power of being able to speak and commune with the tarot archetypes. Napoleon Hill did it using only his imagination. And I mean, he was so impressed with it, he recommended it in his book, Think and Grow Rich. Carl Jung, I'm not really sure if he used tarot. I think he was familiar with the tarot, but he used his own imagination to connect with the archetypes that he was familiar with. I use tarot, I use my imagination, I use my dream states. But I mean, all these tools are available. And all you have to do is reach out, pick up the ones that resonate with you, and start using them more consciously. And tarot is one of those tools that anyone can use. Just get over your fear, get over your prejudice, and open yourself up to the possibilities of connecting with the 78 living beings known as the tarot archetypes. Archetypes that are not alive in the traditional flesh and blood sense, but are living in the collective unconscious. Archetypes that have influenced great figures from the past and are still living today to help give their aid and support to you. So that's the video. Let me know below what you think about this. Do you agree, disagree, all that? This is a little longer than my normal video presentations, but this is, one of our deep dive videos. I try to do one of these about once a week. And if you've borne with me this long and you're intrigued by the concept of the mastermind, I'm going to have a link in the video description down below that will give you free access to a mastermind, a Law of Attraction Mastermind that has been going on for 14 years straight. It's called the Think and Grow Rich Mastermind, based largely on the book Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, and it's absolutely free. It's a mastermind by phone. People from all over the world can join in. If you'd like to get that information, check the link down below. And we also have other offers that you can find down below as well. So, until later, this is Ralph signing out. Have a great weekend. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.